Imagine standing in front of a judge, right? You are facing actual prison time for a social media post, and the primary evidence they use to prove your malicious criminal intent is it's your PhD diploma.
Which is just wild. It completely flips the presumption of innocence. Like your education, the very thing that proves your intellect, becomes the actual weapon used to secure your conviction.
Yeah, and that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We are unpacking this really fascinating and, frankly, terrifying collision between the justice system, complex physics, and high-level philosophy.
It really is a crazy intersection.
It is. We're looking at a real-world legal case where a man's doctorate was used against him, and he decided to fight back using the literal laws of the universe.
And to do this, we are pulling from a very unique stack of sources. We've got a collection of legal documents, the actual court rulings, and crucially, the defendant's own written defense.
Which he drafted from his prison cell, right?
Exactly, from his cell.
Yeah.
And we also have these comprehensive legal evaluations of the case, which were generated by AI models specifically analyzing Chinese criminal law to, objectively evaluate the court's logic.
Right, which gives us a really solid analytical baseline. But before we get into the weeds here, I need to give a really crucial disclaimer for you listening.
Yeah, definitely necessary for this one.
The sources we are examining today involve some highly politically charged content. This case revolves around posts concerning national leadership, international relations, intense ideological debates within China.
Right.
So we need to be absolutely clear up front. Neither of us takes any side here, nor do we endorse any of the political viewpoints contained in the original source material.
None of them. We're just looking at the structure of it all.
Exactly. Our goal today is strictly to impartially report on the legal, philosophical, and scientific arguments that were used in this extraordinary case.
Yeah, we are entirely focused on the architecture of the arguments, the mechanics of how the defense and the prosecution operated, not endorsing the political content of the tweets themselves.
So to really understand the sheer scale of the scientific defense that happens later, we need to first establish the baseline facts of the legal battle.
The foundation, right?
Yeah. So at the center of this is Dr. Chen Jingyuan. He's a researcher with a PhD, and he specializes in complex systems physics.
Which becomes incredibly relevant later.
Very relevant. So from around 2019 to 2022, he used a VPN to access Twitter, which of course is blocked in China. And he retweeted a handful of posts.
Just a few of them.
Yeah, including a 2020 post from the U.S. Embassy. But the critical detail in the sources, the thing we really need to focus on, is the scale of his digital footprint.
Right, because it was virtually non-existent.
Exactly.
I mean, he had fewer than 100 followers. His posts had zero interaction, like no likes, no retweets, no widespread shares at all.
Just dead air.
Yeah, he was practically screaming into an empty void.
Yet, despite that, he was arrested and ultimately sentenced to 20 months in prison.
20 months? For retweets with zero likes.
Yeah. Under the charge of picking quarrels and provoking trouble, which is this broad but very established charge in the Chinese legal system.
Right.
But the prosecution and the court's core argument for, why he had criminal intent, that is where this gets completely mind-bending.
Oh, this is what the AI legal evaluations in our sources refer to as the PhD trap.
The PhD trap.
Yeah, so the court argued that because Dr. Chen has a PhD, because he possesses a high level of advanced education, he, and this is a quote, ought to be able to distinguish right from wrong.
Okay.
Therefore, the court concluded he must have known. The legal term in Chinese they use is mingxi. He must have known that these specific posts were false rumors.
Because he's smart.
Right. And because he must have known, his simple act of retweeting them proved that he harbored subjective malice and criminal intent.
Okay, that is just, it's like assuming someone with a culinary degree intentionally poisoned a meal just because they know what bleach is.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Like you aren't providing any physical proof that they actually poured the bleach into the food or that they even wanted to hurt anyone. You're basically just pointing at them and saying, well, you have a diploma, therefore you are guilty of malice.
And those AI legal evaluations in our sources, they tear that exact logic apart.
I would hope so.
Yeah, they point out that this fundamentally violates a massive cornerstone of criminal law. It's known as the subjective and objective unity principle.
Subjective and objective unity.
Right, meaning to convict someone, the objective, so the retweeting, must clearly match a subjective state of mind.
Like actually knowing the info is false.
Exactly, actually knowing that specific information is false and actively wanting to cause chaos with it. But the court, basically bypassed proving his state of mind entirely.
They just skipped it.
Totally skipped it. They relied on what the sources call character-based inference.
They just looked at his identity tag, like PhD equals smart, smart equals knows everything, therefore guilty.
Yep. They didn't have a confession. They didn't have evidence of him, like, ignoring official warnings to take the post down. Just his diploma.
Okay, but let me push back on this for just a second. Because the law does make assumptions about what we should know, right?
Sure, it does.
Like, there is a reasonable person standard. If you drive a car at 80 miles an hour through a crowded pedestrian market, the law assumes a reasonable person knows that's lethal.
Right, of course.
So why is holding a highly educated researcher to a slightly higher standard of common sense considered such a fatal legal error in this specific case?
That's a really good question. The distinction here comes down to the massive gap between a moral ought to know and the strict legal requirement of actual psychological knowing.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So, the legal sources emphasize that ought to know implies a cognitive capacity. Yes, a guy with a PhD can read and process complex texts better than average, obviously. But criminal intent requires proving that at that specific moment in time, the defendant actually knew the information in front of him was definitively false and spread it anyway to cause harm.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, you cannot logically jump from, well, he has the capacity to verify facts, to he definitely verified these specific political tweets and intentionally spread lies.
Because doing that transforms a legal burden of proof into a presumption of guilt based entirely on your social status.
Exactly. It creates this bizarre system of reverse discrimination. Like, intellectuals, researchers, basically anyone with an advanced degree is automatically presumed guilty of malice simply because they are educated.
Wow. I mean, think about your own internet browser right now, or like your phone's open tabs.
Oh, it's a mess.
Right. Think about how many controversial articles, bizarre conspiracy theories, or intense political debates you, as the listener, have bookmarked just to read later, or just because you wanted to understand a different perspective.
I do it all the time.
Under this court's logic, that bookmark is a crime scene. Your curiosity, combined with whatever college degree you have, proves you are maliciously trying to destroy society.
It transforms the internet from a place of inquiry into this minefield where your own intellect is literally the tripwire.
Which brings us to Dr. Chen's defense from his prison cell. Because the court argued he must have known the ultimate truth of these political posts due to his education, he used that exact same education to prove that knowing the ultimate truth is fundamentally impossible.
He basically attacks the court's entire epistemological foundation.
Epistemology, right?
Yeah.
So that is simply the study of knowledge, like how we know what we know.
Right. And the court's entire case rests on this huge assumption that there is an absolute, easily identifiable objective truth to complex political and historical debates.
Which is a bold claim.
Very bold. So Dr. Chen counters this by invoking Plato's allegory of the cave.
Oh man, the classic philosophical thought experiment. For those who haven't thought about this since college, it's the idea that humans are chained inside a dark cave, right?
Right.
Facing a blank wall.
Right. And they watch shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them.
And they think the shadows are absolute reality because it's literally all they've ever seen.
Exactly. So Dr. Chen is essentially telling the court, look, we are all chained in that cave. Humans only ever see shadows of reality.
Wow.
Therefore, claiming absolute, unquestionable certainty about incredibly complex, multifaceted political or historical events, it's not just arrogant. It is philosophically impossible.
That is a wild argument to make in a criminal court.
But he doesn't just rely on ancient philosophy. He brings in the heaviest hitters of mathematics, too. He actually uses Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Okay, wait. We need to slow down and explain Gödel because that is a massive concept to drop into a courtroom defense.
Oh, for sure. So Kurt Gödel was this logician who completely shattered mathematics in the 1930s. In really simple terms, he proved mathematically that any sufficiently complex logical system cannot be entirely self-proving or complete.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning even within mathematics, which is like the most rigorous objective language in the universe, there will always be statements that are entirely true, but that the system itself can never actually prove.
So there are inherent structural blind spots.
Exactly. Blind spots are baked into the math.
So how on earth does Dr. Chen apply a 1930s mathematical proof to retweeting a U.S. embassy post.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
He argues that if mathematics itself has fundamental blind spots, human reason absolutely has limits.
Oh.
Right? If the most perfect logical system admits it cannot prove everything, how can a state-sponsored narrative about a messy, subjective political event claim 100% objective, unquestionable truth?
It can't.
It can't. Therefore, as a scientist, Dr. Chen's default state of mind isn't knowing everything. His default state is epistemic humility.
Epistemic humility. So he's saying, I am cognitively wired by my profession to doubt everything. When he saw those tweets, he didn't view them as absolute facts to be maliciously broadcast to the world. He viewed them as differing perspectives, like shadows on the cave wall, to be cataloged and analyzed.
Exactly. He makes it impossible for the prosecution to prove he knowingly spread a definitive lie because he doesn't believe definitive, unquestionable truths even exist in these subjective spaces to begin with.
I have to challenge this, though.
Go for it.
Because it's an incredible philosophical flex, right? But isn't it way too abstract for a criminal trial? I mean, if someone yells fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire, we don't sit around the courtroom quoting Plato and Gödel about the subjective nature of reality.
True.
People get trampled. Reality has actual consequences.
And practically speaking, the sources do note that courts almost never engage with philosophy on this level. They just don't.
Right.
However,
Right.
legally speaking, it is a brilliant trap.
How so?
By arguing that absolute truth is elusive, Dr. Chen forces the prosecution into an impossible corner. If the prosecution wants to confidently claim he knowingly spread lies, they first have to prove to the court that an absolute truth actually exists regarding these highly subjective political debates.
Oh, wow.
And not just that it exists, but that their specific version of it is mathematically infallible.
So he exposes the court's unspoken assumption of a single state-sanctioned truth. He literally forces them to say the quiet part out loud.
Yes.
Okay, so with philosophy, he completely dismantled the subjective element of his crime, the idea that he had criminal intent.
Right.
But he doesn't stop there. He uses his day job, his expertise as a complex systems physicist, to completely dismantle the objective element of the crime.
This is where it gets really fun.
Because to be guilty, the law requires that his actions cause serious public disorder.
Right. And this is where we get into the physics of an avalanche. Dr. Chen applies the principles of self-organized criticality, or SOC, to social networks.
Okay, walk me through that. What does a critical state actually look like in physics?
Think of the famous sand pile model.
Okay.
You drop grains of sand onto a table, one by one. It builds into a pile. Eventually, the pile gets so steep that it reaches a critical state.
You can't hold anymore.
Right. At that point, dropping just one more tiny grain of sand can cause a massive, catastrophic avalanche that collapses the whole pile.
And the court's implicit argument is that Dr. Chen's retweets were those tiny grains of sand that caused a societal avalanche.
Exactly. A serious public disorder.
Right.
But Dr. Chen brings in something called the CAP theorem. The CAP theorem states that in any distributed network, like a computer network or a social media platform, you can only ever guarantee 2 out of 3 things: consistency, availability, and partition tolerance.
Okay, and social networks heavily prioritize availability and partition tolerance, right? They want the network to stay up and allow everyone to post, even if parts of the network lose connection.
Which means they sacrifice consistency.
Right. The truth across the network is fragmented by design.
Exactly. By their very physical architecture, social networks are intrinsically disordered. Noise and chaos are baked right into the physics of the system.
So you cannot blame one random person for the noise of a system that is fundamentally designed to be noisy.
Exactly. But he goes even deeper than that. He looks at the topology of the network using the concept of scale-free networks.
This is the idea that the internet isn't like this egalitarian utopia where everyone has an equal voice.
Right. Social networks are scale-free. You have a handful of massive hubs, celebrities, state media, huge influencers, and they have millions of followers.
Megaphones.
Yeah. And then you have millions of tiny marginal nodes with almost 0 followers.
Which is what Dr. Chen is, a marginal node.
Right. So to prove his specific account caused an avalanche, he brings in Cohen's critical threshold formula and the Galton-Watson extinction theorem.
Okay, without turning this into a college lecture, how does he mathematically prove his innocence using those theorems?
It all comes down to his average branching number.
Average branching number. Okay.
Think of it like a family tree. If every family has, on average, more than one child, the family name grows and spreads over generations.
Makes sense.
But if the average is less than 1, say, zero point 0.1 mathematics guarantees that the family name will eventually go extinct. It physically cannot sustain itself.
Okay, and applied to Twitter.
If a hub node with 1 million followers shares a post, their branching number is massive. The signal grows exponentially. But Dr. Chen, with his 100 followers and 0 interaction, has an average branching number vastly less than 1.
Oh.
Mathematically, his account exists in a deep subcritical zone.
Meaning any signal he puts out is mathematically guaranteed to just fizzle out and die.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The probability of his retweets causing a system-wide avalanche, which, remember, is the strict legal requirement of serious public disorder, is essentially 0.
It's just 0.
It is a physical, mathematical impossibility for his specific marginal node to have caused the objective harm required by the law, unless, of course, a massive hub node picked it up and amplified it.
Which didn't happen.
Which didn't happen.
But wait, let me throw another physics concept at this. Because the prosecution could easily argue the butterfly effect, right?
Oh, the classic counter-argument.
Yeah, the famous idea that a tiny flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil can set off a chain reaction that causes a tornado in Texas.
Oh.
Couldn't a single retweet from a tiny account under the exact right atmospheric conditions cause a hurricane of public disorder?
The source material shows Dr. Chen anticipated this exact counter-argument.
Of course he did.
He knows the physics way better than the judge. He points out that the butterfly effect is not magic. It does not happen in a vacuum.
Okay.
It only works if the entire system is already in a supercritical state.
Meaning the system is already so unstable, so on the absolute verge of total collapse, that a butterfly bumping into it could knock the whole thing over.
Yes. If the state wants to use the butterfly effect to say Dr. Chen's tiny retweet caused serious disorder, they must legally prove to the court that Chinese society was already in a supercritical state.
Oh my God.
They would have to admit, on the record, that their society is so incredibly fragile and fundamentally broken that a single tweet from an account with 0 engagement could destroy the entire public order.
That is checkmate. That is a burden of proof the state would never, ever want to claim.
Never.
By bringing in the strict, literal physics of the butterfly effect, he neutralizes it entirely.
He completely traps them. And from there, he moves into a logical argument called Reductio ad absurdum.
Which is taking the court's logic and reducing it to its absolute absurd conclusion.
Exactly, to show the broader societal implications.
Because if we follow the court's logic, that having a degree makes you guilty of malice just for looking at controversial things, the collateral damage extends way beyond one physicist in a courtroom.
Way beyond.
Every single scholar, every researcher, every citizen who wants to understand multiple sides of a debate is automatically a criminal. The sheer act of thinking becomes a crime.
And he highlights the glaring selective enforcement of this, too.
Right.
He was arrested for hitting retweet. But the original authors of the posts and the thousands of other people who share them were completely ignored.
They didn't get arrested.
No. The law was applied selectively to punish him.
Which brings us back to the network physics. If we apply his network math to the court itself, Dr. Chen is a marginal node. He has no power.
Right.
But the judicial system has ultimate reach and absolute authority. If anyone is a hub node capable of causing a societal avalanche, wouldn't it be them?
That is exactly his closing argument.
Seriously.
Yeah. By abusing their immense power, by ignoring actual evidence in favor of identity tags, and by systematically destroying public trust to persecute individuals, the judicial authorities are the ones injecting massive destabilizing energy into the system.
Wow.
They're acting as the detonator for a systemic collapse.
Right.
Not him.
So, stepping back to look at the massive scope of this deep dive, we're looking at a story of a brilliant mind marshaling the absolute highest levels of human reasoning. He used Plato's epistemology, Gödel's mathematics, network topology, complex systems physics. He brought all of that to fight back against a blunt, bureaucratic assumption of guilt.
And intellectually, Dr. Chen won the battle flawlessly.
He really did.
His defense dismantled every single pillar of the prosecution's case. He mathematically disproved the objective harm, and he philosophically disproved the subjective intent. But tragically, none of it mattered.
It never does.
He was completely ignored by the institutional power. The court maintained his 20-month prison sentence. The sheer force of the state didn't need to engage with his logic. It simply rolled right over it.
It's a really sobering reminder of the limits of logic when faced with raw authority. Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Something to mull over that builds on this incredible intersection of networks and responsibility.
That's a big question.
It is. We've spent this entire time looking at how a human user interacts with a network and how a government tries to hold that human individually responsible for the chaos of the system. But what about the algorithms themselves?
The underlying architecture that dictates what we actually see.
Exactly. In today's digital age, social media platforms are deliberately designed by corporations to artificially boost outrage.
Because it works.
Right. They want to keep us engaged, and anger drives engagement. The platforms intentionally curate the noise. So if a complex system is deliberately pushed into a supercritical state by an algorithm designed purely for profit.
Can we ever truly hold an individual user responsible for the avalanche that follows?
Right. If the platform rigged the entire mountain with explosives, who is the real author of the chaos when a single snowflake falls?